Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Fish with Historic Beverly, and welcome to another one of our Spotlight Talks. Today, we are going to be discussing the copy of the Declaration of Independence that is in our collection. We call this copy the Russell Broadside, after the printmaker of the broadside, Ezekiel Russell of Salem. You might be wondering what exactly a broadside is. A broadside is something that we would today equate to a poster. It was a document that could be posted for people to read, or it could be read aloud to crowds. It's important to remember that the methods of communication were much different in 1776. So the reading of a broadside would be a great way to announce and spread the information to large groups of people quickly. It's important to understand some of the history of the Declaration of Independence in order to understand the significance of this broadside. Of course, the history that led up to the signing of the document is vast. We're going to be jumping to June 11th, 1776, during the Second Continental Congress. On this day, the Committee of Five, which consisted of John Adams of Massachusetts, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, and Robert Livingston of New York, were tasked with drafting an initial copy of a declaration to explain why the colonies felt the need to declare independence from Great Britain. The Second Continental Congress was on a recess, which gave the committee members about 3 weeks to draft the document. Recognizing the challenges of writing a document with 5 different parties involved, the committee decided that Jefferson would be responsible for writing the first draft of the document. Over the next 17 days, he produced a draft which he shared with his fellow committee members, who reviewed the draft and made several edits and suggestions. It was during this period of editing that some of the more famous phrases from the document came to be. For example, in Jefferson's original draft, he wrote, "The preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness." And after the review by other committee members, this was shortened to the infamous "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Jefferson rewrote the document to incorporate this and other changes, and this was the document that was presented to Congress on June 28, 1776. At the time, the document was titled "A Declaration by the Representatives of the United States of America in General Congress Assembled." The moment of the Committee of Five presenting their draft to Congress is commemorated in John Trumbull's famous 1818 painting titled "The Declaration of Independence." A common misconception is that this painting represents the actual signing of the document. And while many of the signers are featured in the painting actually represents the first moment that Congress was presented with a draft of the document. Congress proceeded to edit the document until July 1st, when a vote was called to see if the declaration would be passed. It's important to note that for voting, each colony received 1 vote. Within each colony's delegation, members could vote however they wanted. However, the majority vote would then represent the colony's vote. For example, if Massachusetts had 5 delegates, with 3 voting yes and 2 voting no, then the colony would be a yes vote. In the vote on July 1st, Pennsylvania and South Carolina both voted no. New York abstained from voting as the delegates had not been given permission to cast a vote by their colony leaders. Delaware also did not cast a vote as there were only 2 delegates present. 1 voted yes and 1 voted no, resulting in a tie. The remaining 9 states voted for adoption. This was a majority, meaning that the next step was for Congress to vote on the document for formal adoption. Suggested that the vote be proposed to the following day on July 2nd. While records exist that tell us what happened during the meeting of Congress, these notes don't exist for what happened after Congress had adjourned for the night. This is unfortunate, as it seems quite a lot happened on the evening of July 1st. When Congress reassembled the following day on July 2nd, a lot had happened. South Carolina changed its vote to yes. In Pennsylvania, 2 of the no delegates abstained from voting, which shifted the majority within the colony and changed the vote to a yes. A convenient 3rd delegate from Delaware arrived and also voted in favor, giving the colony a majority yes vote. Unfortunately for New York, they still had not received permission to vote and once again abstained. Their permission to vote would come a week later, and with a 12-colony majority, the resolution was adopted, and the colonies officially severed ties with Great Britain. Interestingly enough, John Adams strongly believed that July 2nd would come to be seen as the Day of Independence. In a letter to his wife Abigail, he wrote, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that the Independence Day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, for this time forward forevermore." The paintings you see here are of John and Abigail Adams, painted by renowned artist Gilbert Stuart. So why do we celebrate July 4th? After the resolution passed, Congress spent a few days editing the document and formalizing the wording. On July 4th, 1776, the wording of the document was approved and it was sent to the publisher for printing. This document was sent to John Dunlap of Philadelphia, who was Congress's official printer. Dunlap produced roughly 200 broadside versions of the document for distribution, of which 26 survive today. Congress ordered that the documents be sent across the colonies for further printing and reading, and seen here is one of the copies currently at the Library of Congress. In 1776, printing hundreds upon hundreds of copies of this document would not have been an easy or quick task. Congress wanted the information disseminated to the people as quickly as possible, and so copies of the Dunlap broadside were sent to many different regional printers who were responsible for publishing the document. This is where the Russell Broadside comes in. Our copy of the Declaration of Independence is 19.5 inches by 14.25 inches in size. The documentation that we have about acquiring the broadside and its history, as it was passed down through a family that dates back to the Civil War. The documentation, in the form of a letter, states, "Attention to Mr. Arthur Appleton, President of the Beverly Historical Society. Greetings. I'm glad you are interested to accept the framed copy of the Declaration of Independence and thus provide a suitable repository for this historical item. Just to indicate how I had possession of it, would say that it came to me when my father, George Rogers Wales, died in 1922. He received it from his aunt, Abby A. Rogers, in 1885, and it came to her from her father, Joseph Smith Rogers, just after the Civil War, and when I had it framed some years ago, a pencil notation to that effect was transferred from the original to the back of the present frame. Signed, John Wales, J.W. To know its history prior to the Civil War is currently unknown at this time. And as you may have guessed, the different broadsides are named after the printers who produced them. In the case of this broadside, it was printed by Ezekiel Russell of Salem. Originally born in Boston, Russell apprenticed in several print shops before beginning his newspaper in 1771 titled The Censor. This was actually a loyalist publication that was designed to essentially be an op-ed for those with pro-Crown views. The paper did not last long and folded after just a few months, likely due to a poor market choice. He then moved to Salem and during the Revolution founded the American Gazette or the Constitutional Journal, and that's the full title. It was in the July 16th issue of this paper that the text of the Declaration was printed, and the broadside issue was printed very shortly thereafter. Congress had ordered that the document be read aloud to all towns and troops. Though we know that a Russell Broadside was read at Independence Park on July 17th, 1776, it is unknown whether this exact copy was the copy read by Colonel John Glover on that day. Following the reading, a 13-gun salute was fired and church bells were rung in celebration. As an interesting note, the Declaration was actually read in Beverly before it was read in Boston. That reading did not happen until a day later on July 18th. These public readings reignited patriotism and the spirit of liberty among the crowds. They also incited some riots, where crowds proceeded to destroy items associated with royal authority. A notable example of this is when Washington read the Declaration to his troops in New York. Crowds proceeded to tear down a massive statue of King George III and melt the metal down for use as ammunition. Now, let's take a closer look at what the Declaration itself looks like. This Declaration consists of 5 parts. The introduction, which asserts that the natural law allows people to be politically independent. The preamble, in which it is argued that revolutions are justified when a government is harmful to the natural rights. The indictment, which documents the many grievances against the king. The denunciation of the British people for allowing this to happen, and essentially says, we warned you, and we would fight back if we did not relieve our suffering, if you did not relieve our suffering. The conclusion, which argues that the colonies are left with no other option but to become independent states. This document then features 56 signatures, arranged for the most part geographically. New Hampshire delegates would sign at the top, Georgia delegates signed at the bottom. You might think that the Russell Broadside and the official copy housed in the National Archives are exactly the same, but it's not true. There's actually some interesting differences to be found. If you look at the Russell Broadside, you'll notice that the only 2 names present on the document are John Hancock, the President of Congress, and Charles Thompson, the Secretary of Congress. This is because when the Russell Broadside was printed, no one else had yet signed their name to the Declaration. The Declaration wasn't officially signed until August 2nd, when Thomas Matlack provided Congress with the official engrossed copy that is displayed at the National Archives today. For those who may not know, an engrossed copy simply means a formal and official handwritten copy of a document. If we continue to focus on the bottom of the Declaration, we also see a unique final paragraph. The Russell Broadside features the local region's order for the declaration to be proclaimed, printed on the broadside itself. The Russell Broadsides are the only known versions of the Declaration to have the local regional orders physically printed on the document itself. Now, if we shift our attention to the top of the document, we can see that it reads, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled." The copy on view in the National Archives opens with the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. The reason for the difference is because when the congressional delegation from New York finally received permission to vote on the matter of independence, they voted yes, which made the vote unanimous. And on July 9th, 1776, Congress voted to formally change the opening of the document to reflect the unanimous decision. This change was reflected in the engrossed copy. Now, let's move to talk a little bit about preservation. If you've ever seen the copy on display at the National Archives, you'll notice that it's been poorly preserved and is currently practically illegible. Much of this is due to a popular practice of the time known as the wet press. This is where a copy of the handwritten document was made by pressing a thin, damp sheet against the original to allow some of the original ink to transfer. Of course, every time this is done, it degrades the document further. And it was not until 1952, when the Declaration permanently went to the National Archives, where proper preservation practices were fully implemented. It is clear from looking at this copy of the Russell Broadside that there has been some damage. And there are portions missing, and there's significant bends in the paper that indicate where it's been repeatedly folded and likely stored for long periods of time. Historic Beverly is committed to preserving this important piece of American history. The document is preserved under UV filtering glass and is kept covered to reduce the amount of light that it receives. The document is also on acid-free and lignin-free matte paper, which helps prevent deterioration. Based on preservation standards set forth in the archives and museum fields, it is best to rotate fragile objects on and off view in order to keep sensitive objects away from prolonged and unnecessary elemental exposure. Our copy has been on view for over 5 years, so it is due time for it to rest and rotate off view. It is suggested in the archival field to be off view for at least 10 years. However, we don't think ours will be away for that long. That brings us to an end to our Broadside Spotlight Talk. We'd like to thank you for coming to the Spotlight Talk, and if you would like to see more like this one, please check us out on our website or follow us on our social media. To keep these programs free and accessible, we ask that you look into donating to Historic Beverly by texting HISTBEV to 44321 or become a member today for an array of benefits. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our research email at research@historicbeverly.net. Again, that's research@historicbeverly.net.